Deep beneath the tranquil surface of the Pacific Ocean, a massive mass of thermal energy is silently moving. When we hear the term El Niño, most of us immediately think of a typical weather report. Unseasonal rain here, localized drought there. But that's a deadly mistake. The mass of warm water creeping along the seabed isn't just changing wind direction. It's extending invisible tentacles directly to the dinner tables of billions of people. This isn't a weather story. This is a story of survival, about the price of every grain of rice, every loaf of bread, and the extreme fragility of the global food system. What would happen if this machine simultaneously suffocated the largest grain reserves? If wheat in the US, rice in India, and the Australian pastures all collapsed in one season, would the world have enough reserves to fill the void? History recorded a chilling precedent in 1877 when a devastating climate synchronized the collapse of multiple continents. 2026 may not necessarily repeat that tragedy, but to understand why an undercurrent can manipulate humanity's survival, we must look at the mechanisms at work beneath the ocean's surface. In mid-May 2026, the US Climate Prediction Center officially issued a message that shook the meteorological world: El Niño Watch. Watch, or the Watch Alert, wasn't a definitive catastrophic verdict. However, it was a serious enough alarm to send global agricultural, energy, and water management systems into a state of readiness. It confirmed that the planet's largest ocean was abandoning its neutral state to embrace a new climate structure. But if you only look at temperature fluctuations on the sea surface, you're missing the core of this machine. The most terrifying truth lies in the fuel source deep beneath the waves. Sensors detect a massive heat mass, called a submerged Kelvin wave, creeping along the ocean floor from west to east. Like a train carrying thermal energy moving across the Pacific Ocean, this body of water carries an unusually high temperature. El Niño never begins with storms. It starts this way. The ocean reorganizes the distribution of heat. But warm water in the deep sea alone isn't enough. For this mechanism to truly explode, the ocean must make the sky respond. For El Niño to become a global manipulator, the ocean and atmosphere must be tightly locked together. Normally, strong trade winds blow from east to west along the equator, pushing warm water toward the western Pacific. But when these winds weaken, the balance breaks down. The massive mass of warm water, no longer restrained, immediately reverses direction, surging toward the center and eastern coast. The warm water heats the air above, altering the pressure. The altered atmosphere then reverses direction, further constricting and weakening the trade winds. It's a vicious feedback loop. Water weakens the wind, and weaker winds make the water hotter. When the loop closes, the El Niño machine officially kicks in. However, scientists are still holding their breath before the spring forecast barrier. At this point, the connection between the sea and the sky remains very loose, creating extremely high uncertainty. The ocean has refueled and is sending out a signal. Whether the sky will actually respond to amplify it remains an unknown. If the atmosphere does officially respond, the question will no longer be whether this phenomenon will occur, but how far its destructive reach will extend. If the sky responds, the most brutal question arises: at what power will this machine run? The difference between a weak El Niño and a Super El Niño isn't a few degrees Celsius on the thermometer. A weak El Niño is just a regional weather phenomenon, adding a little rain here, a little less moisture there. But when it crosses the red line, it evolves into something entirely different. The core issue isn't how much warmer the ocean El Niño makes. The issue is that once it crosses that threshold, it's no longer local weather. It becomes a planet-wide climate mechanism. It's powerful enough to reroute atmospheric circulation, bend jet streams, and stifle monsoon patterns across continents. It becomes the single switch that forces vast food granaries to dry up simultaneously. Current supercomputer forecasts all point to the very real risk of a strong or very strong event. Although science hasn't yet confirmed a 100% probability, the warning has been issued. And to understand the destructive power when this machine runs at maximum capacity, we must revisit the bloody year that the world has deliberately tried to forget. Between 1876 and 1878, the world witnessed a horrific humanitarian tragedy. Tens of millions of lives were wiped out, not because of war, but because the rain from the sky suddenly stopped falling. Famine devastated wheat fields in North China, scorched the rice paddies in India, suffocated northeastern Brazil, and spread throughout Southeast Asia and parts of Africa. The most terrifying aspect of the 1877 disaster was not the severity of a single drought. The real horror lay in its cruel, simultaneous nature. A series of massive agricultural centers were simultaneously disrupted by the climate system. When the monsoon regions collapsed en masse, a law of survival was stripped away. There were no longer any surplus areas on the planet large enough to fill the chasms of the shortages. Trade became powerless as the leading sectors of production crumbled together. We are not claiming that 2026 will repeat the tragedy of 1877 exactly. But 1877 is not a prophecy. It is absolute physical evidence proving that climate systems have the power to synchronize disasters on a multi-continental scale. And behind those parched fields is not chance, but an extreme climate machine. The year 1877 was not a series of random disasters. From a scientific perspective, it was the result of an extreme configuration known as the triple whammy. Three massive oceans simultaneously pulled the climate system in the wrong direction. First, the Pacific Super El Niño choked the atmosphere, completely paralyzing the Asian monsoon. Second came the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean dipole, like a temperature seesaw, tilted sharply toward the most extreme positive phase in history. It deprived the region of vital rainfall, inflicting devastating droughts on Australia and South Asia. Finally, the North Atlantic warmed abnormally, bending the trajectory of moisture, plunging northeastern Brazil and Africa into arid conditions. These three factors did not act independently. They superimposed themselves, striking vulnerable food sources and creating a drought map that engulfed multiple continents at once. The year 2026 doesn't necessarily have to replicate this configuration, but the pieces are emerging. El Niño is forming, global oceans are warming, and the Indian Ocean is an unpredictable variable. Knowing this machine exists, the crucial question is the modern food system built to withstand a similar blow? When we realize the climate machine possesses the power of synchronized destruction, we are forced to confront an even more horrifying truth. The modern food system is built on a devastatingly flawed assumption. From crop insurance and national reserves to multi-billion-dollar supply chains, everything operates on the belief that massive grain reserves will never all collapse at once. If the US suffers a crop failure, we'll buy from India. If Australia experiences drought, Brazil will take the burden. This system is designed as if nations are rolling dice at completely independent stakes. But research in science advances has shattered that illusion, proving El Niño is the only climate mechanism powerful enough to strip away this independence. The Pacific machine has the power to grab all of humanity's dice and force them to land on the same face. Crop failure. When independence crumbles, the global safety net is instantly paralyzed. You can't import food if your trading partners are also running out of storage. But El Niño doesn't strike blindly. It paints a map of devastating losses, where things are stripped bare, where life is preserved, and where the world desperately clings to a lifeline. El Niño doesn't strike blindly. It maps out a cold, structured loss map. A deadly red hue immediately engulfs India and Southeast Asia, depriving vast rice-producing regions of rainfall. It sweeps through Australia's wheat belt, draining pastures, and then spreads to North China, South Africa, and Brazil. The fatal commonality of these lands? They all live and die in rhythm with the monsoon winds. When El Niño constricts atmospheric circulation, the planting schedules of billions are torn apart. If rains are delayed, yields plummet. If droughts persist, these fields become graveyards of global production. As the map bleeds, human lives are pushed onto the buffer zone in the Midwest United States, Argentina, and southern Brazil. The trade system is betting that these rare, fragile green areas, favored by El Niño, will produce enough surplus grain to offset and fill the gap left by the rest. The harsh truth is, climate doesn't need to incinerate the entire world to create a crisis. It only needs to cripple core food reserves precisely when humanity's only lifeline is weakening. And the nightmare is unfolding because as we enter 2026, that last remaining lifeline appears to be thinning at an alarming rate. An extreme El Niño would be a fatal blow if humanity's last line of defense were to be exhausted. The lifeline isn't just grain in the fields, but national stocks. When stocks are high, the world can absorb a crop failure, but when stocks are empty, the yield shock immediately triggers a price shock. The harsh reality of 2026 is that lifeline is tearing apart. The United States, the largest buffer zone, is entering the battle with a limp. U.S. Department of Agriculture data indicates that winter wheat was already being strangled by severe drought even before El Niño peaked. The vast agricultural belt is struggling with its own thirst. Instead of having a surplus to save other continents, the cracks are spreading on the ground. In Australia, farmers are selling off livestock at record rates knowing pastures are dying. In Southeast Asia, planting schedules must be urgently adjusted. The entire modern economy operates on a just-in-time and desert model, no stockpiling, only importing when needed. This mindset becomes useless in the face of a simultaneous catastrophe. The logic of buying from somewhere else will completely collapse. When the ocean flips over, there will be no somewhere else with surplus food to sell you. When the cushion tears, the shock doesn't stop in the fields. It creeps through storage facilities, across oceans on supertankers, into trading floors, and directly hits the dinner table. Climate doesn't need to wipe out every grain to create a crisis. It just needs to stifle production in enough places at the right time when reserves are depleted to ignite a merciless price surge. When wheat prices decline, loaves of bread or packets of pasta will skyrocket in price, cornering importing nations. For rice, the lifeblood of billions of Asians, a weakening monsoon will trigger chaos. A corn crop failure will spread disaster to the barns. Soaring feed prices have instantly turned meat, eggs, and milk on supermarket shelves into luxury items. A surplus of soybeans is irreparable, as it cannot replace a daily bowl of rice. The modern food crisis doesn't manifest itself through empty shelves. Food remains wrapped in shiny plastic, but new price lists will snatch it from the hands of the poor. When the boundaries of survival are measured by price differences, the vulnerable will be crushed first. Food crises don't just arise from drought-stricken fields. They are fueled by human reactions. When fear of shortages sets in, a vicious cycle of defense is immediately triggered. Importing nations panic and stockpile. In return, exporting powers shut their doors, imposing bans on exports to protect their domestic security. This panic amplifies the disaster. Trade grinds to a halt. Droughts continue to stifle vital waterways, driving logistics costs to unimaginable levels. El Niño reduces the amount of food grown, but it is fear that deprives the amount of food sold. Climate is merely the trigger. It is how humans manipulate the market that determines the scale of the devastation. El Niño 2026 didn't appear on a normal planet. It rose on a fiery stage with record-breaking temperatures. The ocean heat was a ruthless amplifier, exacerbating droughts. But modern humanity isn't as blind as it was in 1877. We're armed with satellites, sophisticated modeling, and new farming technologies. We see the climate machine at work before it strikes. The question isn't whether we know, but whether the world will act proactively or simply wait for disaster to be etched onto the food bill. The Pacific doesn't need to starve the entire planet to change history. It just needs to stifle enough grain reserves at once. In a year when reserves are low, the seas are scorching hot. and the system is still blindly betting that the nightmare won't happen.